What is the true price of compassion? For Rosemary Hayes, a widow in the harsh frontier town of Redemption Creek, it was everything she had. In 1878, when she'd come to save the life of a wounded Apache warrior, an enemy in the eyes of her neighbors, the town repaid her with scorn. They laughed at her, called her a traitor, and cast her out. But they never imagined that this one act of defiance would unravel a dark conspiracy of greed and murder that held their entire valley in its grip. This is the story of how the woman they mocked became a legend to the very people they feared, and how the Apache came to call her by a name worth more than all the gold in the territory's keeper of honor. The dust of redemption. Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated sorrows and secrets alike. For Rosemary Hayes, it was the dust of a life paused. It had been 2 years since her husband Franklin, a geologist with more dreams than luck, had been found dead at the base of the Black Mesa, the victim, the town concluded, of an Apache raiding party. Since then, Rosemary lived in the small adobe house at the edge of town, a place where the settled world frayed into the vast, untamed wilderness. She kept to herself, tending her garden, selling herbal remedies to the few who still spoke to her, and carrying her grief like a shawl. On a blistering July afternoon, that fragile peace was shattered. A frantic shout from a boy named Timothy, the blacksmith's son, sent a ripple of alarm through the main street. They got 1. Sheriff got an Apache. Doors creaked open. Faces hard and sun-beaten peered out. Rosemary watched from her window as Sheriff Bo Garrett, a man whose authority came more from the size of his gut and the shine of his badge than from any sense of justice, rode proudly into town. Slumped over the horse in front of him was a near-naked man, his dark skin slick with blood and sweat. He was Apache. His hands were bound, and a bloody gash ran from his temple down his cheek, another deeper wound weeping crimson onto the horse's flank from his side. Sheriff Garrett hauled the man from the horse and dumped him in the center of the street like a sack of grain. The Apache warrior groaned a low, guttural sound of profound pain, but his eyes, when they briefly fluttered open, burned with a defiant fire that stunned Rosemary. Found this heathen skulking near the old Double H line, Garrett boomed, playing to the gathering crowd. Bartholomew Higgins, the owner of the sprawling Double H ranch and the unofficial king of Redemption Creek, stepped from the saloon, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Good work," Sheriff Higgins said, his voice smooth as whiskey, but with an undertone of cold steel. "Another one of them won't be bothering our cattle." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Martha Pritchett, the portly wife of the general store owner, spat on the ground. "Let him bleed out. It's what they deserve after what they did to poor Franklin Hayes." The mention of her husband's name was a physical blow to Rosemary. She saw the sideways glances, the mix of pity and accusation. The town had decided the Apache were a monolithic evil, the source of all their hardships. "What'll you do with him, Sheriff?" someone called out. "I aim to let him bake a while," Garrett declared with a cruel grin. "Then we'll hang what's left as a warning to his friends." Laughter erupted. It was a harsh, ugly sound that grated on Rosemary's soul. They were laughing as a human being, regardless of his tribe or alleged crimes, lay dying in the dirt. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. She saw the flies already beginning to gather at his wounds. Something inside her, a core of decency inherited from her father. A country doctor snapped, before she could second-guess the impulse Rosemary was pushing through the crowd. hush fell as she knelt beside the wounded man. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "Mrs. Hayes." Sheriff Garrett demanded his hand moving to the butt of his pistol. Rosemary ignored him. She gently touched the man's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, thready. "He's dying," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "That's the point," Bart Higgins sneered. "Step away from him. This is town business." Rosemary looked up, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces. She saw Martha Pritchett, Sheriff Garrett, Bart Higgins, and dozens of others who had once been her friends and neighbors. Now they looked at her with contempt. "This is a human being," she stated, her voice rising, "and I will not stand by and watch a man die in the street like a dog." "He's an Apache," Martha Pritchett shrieked. "The same kind that murdered your husband. Have you no shame?" The laughter started again, louder this time, laced with mockery. "Look at her. The widow Hayes playing nursemaid to a redskin." A ranch hand hollered, "Maybe she's lonely." The words were like stones, but Rosemary shielded herself with resolve. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressed it against the gushing wound in his side. The Apache warrior's eyes flickered open again, locking onto hers. There was no hatred in them, only a flicker of shocked surprise. "I said get away from him, Sheriff Garrett," bellowed, taking a step forward. Rosemary didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her blue eyes as cold as a winter sky. "You want to stop me, Sheriff? You'll have to shoot me. Go ahead. Show this whole town what kind of lawman you really are. A man who shoots unarmed women for showing a shred of Christian mercy." Garrett froze. He was a bully, not a cold-blooded killer in front of witnesses. He glanced at Higgins, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The entertainment wasn't worth the complication. "You're a fool, Rosemary Higgins," said softly, the threat more potent for its quiet delivery. "You're choosing your side. Don't expect any help from the good people of this town when his kin come looking for him." Rosemary ignored them all. With the help of Timothy, the blacksmith's boy, who had watched the scene with wide, horrified eyes, she managed to get the wounded man onto a makeshift travois. The crowd parted before her, not with respect, but with a kind of revulsion, as if she were a leper. The laughter had died, replaced by a simmering, venomous silence that was somehow worse. As she dragged the wounded Apache toward her small home, she knew she had crossed a line. She was no longer just the grieving widow. She was an outcast, a traitor. She had defied the town, the law, and the powerful man who ran it all for a stranger the world had told her to hate. She didn't know his name or his story, but as she closed her door against the judging eyes of Redemption Creek, she knew one thing for certain. Her life and the life of this town would never be the same. The small adobe house became a fortress and a prison. Rosemary barred the door and covered the windows, shutting out the world that had so quickly turned on her. The air inside was thick with the scent of blood dust and the potent herbs she brewed on her stove. The Apache warrior lay on Franklin's old cot, drifting in and out of consciousness. Cleaning his wounds was a gruesome task. The gash on his face was deep, but it was the one in his side that threatened his life. It was ragged, torn by a bullet that had gone clean through, but it was already showing signs of infection. Working by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Rosemary used skills her father had taught her. She boiled water, sterilized her sharpest knife in the flame, and prepared a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding and willow bark, for the fever she knew would come. For 3 days and nights, she was his keeper. She bathed his feverish skin, forced sips of willow bark tea and thin broth between his cracked lips, and changed the dressing on his wounds until her own hands were raw. During his bouts of delirium, he spoke in his native tongue, words that were meaningless to her, but their tone was one of anguish and urgency. He thrashed in the cot, his hands reaching for an unseen enemy, his voice calling out names she didn't recognize. But a few words spoken in broken, guttural English snagged her attention. Silver bullet, not raid, stolen water, Black Mesa. The mention of Black Mesa sent a chill down her spine. That was where Franklin had died. The sheriff's report had been simple, an Apache arrow in his back while he was prospecting. But Franklin hadn't been prospecting for gold or silver. He had been mapping rock strata, obsessed with a theory about underground water tables. The real wealth in this desert, Rosie, he used to say, isn't rock, it's water. The town's retribution was swift and silent. No one came to her door. When she sent young Timothy to the general store for flour and salt pork, Mr. Pritchett refused to sell to him. Tell the squaw lover she can eat grass with her pet, he'd snarled. The boy, shamed and frightened, never came back. Her small garden became her only source of food. Loneliness was a constant, heavy presence. In the dead of night, she would sit by the window, peering through a crack in the curtains at the town sleeping under a blanket of stars. She saw Sheriff Garrett make his rounds, deliberately pausing in front of her house for a long, intimidating moment. She saw ranch hands from the Double H ride by, their laughter loud and cruel in the quiet air. She was isolated, a pariah in her own home. During those long hours, doubt became her tormentor. Was she a fool? Had she thrown away her life for a man who might, upon waking, try to kill her? Was Martha Pritchett right? Was this a betrayal of Franklin's memory? She would look at her husband's worn geological hammer, hanging on the wall, then at the sleeping Apache. The two images warred in her mind. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Rosemary was dozing in a chair, utterly exhausted, when a sound startled her awake. The Apache was sitting up, his dark eyes, clear and intelligent, fixed on her. He was weak, but the delirium was gone. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The silence was not hostile, but heavy with questions. Water, he finally rasped, his voice rough. Rosemary fetched him a cup, her hand trembling slightly. He drank it down, his eyes never leaving her face. He gestured to the empty cup, and she refilled it. After the second cup, he leaned back against the wall, his gaze sweeping the small room before settling on her again. Why, he asked. The single word held a world of meaning. Why did you help me? Why did you risk everything? Rosemary sank back into her chair. I don't believe in letting a man die in the dirt, she said simply. He studied her, his expression unreadable. They call you traitor. It wasn't a question. He must have heard the shouts. They call me many things, Rosemary replied, a weary bitterness in her voice. It doesn't make them true. My people, he said, his voice stronger now, would have killed you for touching a warrior's wounds without permission. But they would not have let you do it, and then mocked you. He seemed to find the town's behavior a deeper insult than any violence. He tried to shift his weight, and winced, his hand going to his side. Be still, Rosemary commanded, moving to his side. The wound is closing, but it will open again if you're not careful. As she checked the dressing, her fingers brushed against his skin. There was no revulsion, only a clinical focus. But for the first time, she saw him not as a patient or a symbol, but as a man. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was, with a face that, if not for the fresh scar, would have been strikingly handsome. It was a face built for harsh sunlight and open spaces, not the dim confines of her home. "You are the widow of the rock man," he stated. Rosemary froze. How do you know that I saw you at his burying?" "You stood alone like a pine on a high ridge." His gaze was intense. "My people did not kill him." Rosemary's heart leaped. The sheriff said, "The sheriff speaks with the tongue of the snake that serves the big rancher." Higgins, the warrior, interrupted, his voice laced with contempt. "Your man was killed by a white man's bullet. The arrow was put thereafter, to start a fire between my people and yours, a fire that helps Higgins. It was too much to absorb. A lie. Franklin's death, the foundation of the town's hatred, a lie." Why, she whispered. Why would he do that? The same reason he ambushed my hunting party. The Apache said, his eyes hardening. Land. Water. He wants the land by the Silver Creek, where our winter camp is. It is sacred ground. He also wants the water that flows beneath it. Your man, the rock man, he found it. Higgins found his maps. Suddenly, the delirious words made a terrifying kind of sense. Stolen water. Black Mesa. Franklin hadn't been killed by Apaches. He had been murdered for what he knew. And this man, he hadn't been raiding. He had been investigating, just as Franklin had. "Who are you?" Rosemary asked, her voice trembling. He met her gaze, a flicker of something profound passing between them, a shared understanding of being hunted. "My name is Kaelte," he said, "and I owe you my life." In that moment, the burden Rosemary had carried felt different. It was no longer just the weight of the town's scorn. It was the weight of a terrible truth, a truth that had cost her a husband and had nearly cost this man his life. The choice she had made in the dusty street was no longer a simple act of mercy. It was the first step on a path far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The days that followed transformed the small house into a clandestine world of healing and revelation. With his fever gone, Kaelte recovered with a speed that astonished Rosemary. His body, honed by a life of hardship and discipline, seemed to knit itself back together. He began to move around the house, his steps quiet and sure, a stark contrast to her own anxious pacing. They spoke in hushed tones, piecing together a puzzle of immense greed. Kaelte described the ambush in detail. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. 10 of his kinsmen, on a ceremonial hunt far from any white settlements, were cut down by rifle fire from the rocks above. The attackers were white men, their faces smudged with dirt, but he recognized 2 as Double H riders. He was wounded in the first volley, but managed to crawl into a crevice where he lay hidden as the attackers moved among the dead planting arrows and taking scalps to create their false narrative. "They use our ways against us," Kaelte said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They make us look like the savages they call us, so they can take what is ours." He explained that his people of the Chiricahua held Silver Creek and its surrounding mesas as sacred. It was not just a place for a winter camp. It was where their ancestors were buried, where the spirits of the mountain dwelled. The water Franklin had discovered was the lifeblood of this sacred land. "Higgins wants to push my people out," Kaelte continued. "He creates fear in your town, turns them against us. He uses the sheriff to enforce his lies. If the people believe we are murderers, they will support a war against us. Then the army will come, and we will be driven onto a reservation of barren rock. Higgins will take the land and the water, and no one will question him. It was a conspiracy so vast and cynical, it made Rosemary feel dizzy. The entire town was a pawn in Bart Higgins' brutal game. Her own grief had been manipulated, weaponized, to fuel the hatred he needed. One evening, as Rosemary was changing the dressing on his side for what she hoped was the last time, Kaelte stopped her. "There is something you must see." He guided her hand to the puckered flesh of the exit wound. With a grimace of pain, he pressed around the area. He had been doing this secretly for days, working something out. With a final pained grunt, he used his fingernails to pry a small, flattened piece of metal from just beneath his skin. It wasn't the bullet itself, but a piece of the casing that must have fragmented and traveled with it. He dropped the distorted brass piece into her palm. "Look closely," he urged. Rosemary held it to the lamplight. It was small and bent, but on the flattened base, she could make out a distinct marking, 2 interlocking H's, the brand of the Double H Ranch. "Higgins orders his ammunition custom-made," Kaelte explained. "He is a vain man. He puts his mark on everything he owns, including his bullets." This was it. Not just a story, but physical proof. It was a tiny piece of brass, but it held the power to bring down an empire built on lies. Rosemary stared at it, her fingers closing around the metal. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of violence. Over the next week, a strange and powerful respect grew between the healer and the warrior. He taught her a few words of his language, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to listen to the desert instead of just looking at it. She, in turn, read to him from one of Franklin's books on geology, explaining the forces that shaped the land he held so sacred. They were from 2 different worlds, but they found common ground in their shared opposition to the darkness that threatened to consume the valley. The day finally came when Kaelte knew he had to leave. His strength had returned, and his people would be worried. The risk of him being discovered grew with every passing hour. "I must go," he announced at dawn, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light peeking past the curtain. Rosemary's heart sank. A part of her was terrified for him to leave, and another part was terrified of what would happen to her when he was gone. She had grown used to his quiet, powerful presence. The silence in the house would be deafening. "They will be watching," she warned. "I will move like smoke," he assured her. He gathered the few things she had given him, a small pouch of dried meat, a water skin, and the old, sharp knife she had used to clean his wounds. Before he unbarred the door, he turned to face her. He stood tall, the morning light tracing the harsh lines of his face and the new scar that now marked him. "You saved my life," he said, his voice filled with a gravity she had never heard before. "But you did more. You saw a man where others saw a monster. You listened to truth when others celebrated lies. In my tribe, honor is not a word. It is a thing you carry, a thing you protect. You have protected the truth of what happened to my people and to your husband. You have protected my honor by believing me." He reached into a small leather pouch tied at his waist, one he had managed to keep hidden. He pulled out a single perfect eagle feather, its tip dyed a deep earthy red. He held it out to her. "My people will know what you have done," he said. "When they see this, they will know you are a friend. They will know you are to be protected. From this day when they speak of you, they will not use your white name. They will call you Keeper of Honor." Tears welled in Rosemary's eyes as she accepted the feather. It was soft and weightless in her hand, yet it felt heavier than gold. It was a promise, a title, a connection to a world she had never known. "Be safe, Kaelte," she whispered. He gave a single, solemn nod. Then, as silent as a shadow, he slipped out the back door and vanished into the pre-dawn gloom. Rosemary stood alone in her house, the eagle feather clutched in one hand and the branded bullet casing in the other. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mixed with something new, a fierce, burning resolve. Kaelte had given her a name and a purpose. She was no longer just Rosemary Hayes, the grieving widow. She was the keeper of honor, and now she had a debt of her own to pay to her husband's memory, and to the truth. Her fight was just beginning. With Kaelte gone, the silence of the small house pressed in on Rosemary. The town's hostility, once a distant murmur, became a palpable threat. Her garden was trampled one night, the tender squash vines crushed under heavy boots. A rock crashed through her window, a piece of paper tied around it with the word "traitor" scrawled in charcoal. Sheriff Garrett made it a point to ride past her house a dozen times a day, his presence a constant, silent warning. But fear had been burned away by purpose. Rosemary knew she couldn't outfight Bart Higgins or outrun Sheriff Garrett. She had to outsmart them. Her weapons were not guns or knives, but the truth, the branded bullet casing, and her own mind. Her first move was to visit the one man in town she thought might still possess a conscience, Dr. Alastair Finch. He was an old, cantankerous man who had been her father's contemporary and rival. He had publicly scoffed at her herbal remedies, but had privately admitted her skill after she'd set the blacksmith's arm better than he could have. She found him in his office smelling of antiseptic and stale pipe smoke. He looked up from his desk, his expression sour. "Rosemary. I'd heard you'd taken in a stray. A dangerous one at that." "I took in a man who was dying, Alistair," she said, her voice even. She placed the small, distorted bullet casing on his cluttered desk. "Does this look familiar to you?" Dr. Finch picked it up, squinting through his spectacles. He grunted. "Looks like a custom casing. Bartholomew Higgins has his stamped like this. Arrogant fool. It's the casing from the bullet I dug out of that stray," Rosemary said, her eyes locked on his. He wasn't raiding the Double H. He and his hunting party were ambushed by Higgins's men. The doctor's face paled slightly. He put the casing down as if it were hot. "Those are dangerous accusations, girl. Higgins owns this town lock, stock, and barrel. He owns the sheriff. He also murdered my husband," Rosemary said the words tasting like ash. "Kaelte, the man I helped, he told me. Franklin wasn't killed by an Apache arrow. He was shot. He found the water source under the Apache's sacred land. Higgins wanted his maps." Dr. Finch sank heavily into his chair, steepling his fingers. He had been the one to pronounce Franklin dead at the scene. He had seen the body. "The arrow wound," he began, but his voice trailed off. He looked at Rosemary, his old eyes filled with a dawning horror. It was clean. Too clean for a man who'd supposedly fallen down a ravine. And the location of the wound, it was precise. But Garrett was there telling us all what we were seeing. We just accepted it. He shook his head slowly. We wanted to accept it. It was easier to blame them. "I need your help, Alistair," Rosemary pleaded. "You were there. Your testimony would mean something." The doctor looked away out the dusty window, toward the main street. He was an old man. He had a comfortable life. To challenge Bart Higgins was to invite ruin or worse. "I can't," he whispered, his voice laced with shame. "He'd destroy me. I'm sorry, Rosemary. You're on your own." Rosemary left his office, feeling a cold dread. If a man like Dr. Finch was too afraid to stand up, what hope did she have? Her despair drove her to search for something more, something undeniable. She tore through Franklin's old belongings, which she had packed away in a large trunk. She unrolled his maps, his survey notes, his journals. For hours she pored over his meticulous handwriting, her heart aching with every familiar swirl of his pen. Most of it was technical data meaningless to her. But then she found it. Tucked into the back of his final journal was a folded, hand-drawn map. It was separate from his official surveys, drawn with more haste and urgency. It showed the area around Silver Creek and the Black Mesa. But this map had notes scrawled in the margins. Notes that made her blood run cold. Higgins knows. Followed me today. Asked too many questions about water tables. He's no fool. And another entry dated 2 days before his death. Massive silver lode directly beneath the sacred spring. The water is secondary. A distraction. He wants the silver. He offered to buy my silence. I refused. I fear I have made a powerful enemy. It wasn't just about water. It was about a fortune in silver ore hidden beneath land the Apache would die to protect. Higgins hadn't just murdered Franklin to secure water rights for his ranch. He'd murdered him to steal a mountain of silver. The fabricated Apache war was the perfect cover to drive them off the land so he could bring in his own mining operation. Armed with this terrifying new knowledge, Rosemary knew she couldn't stay silent. She had to expose him whatever the cost. Her next stop was the one place she knew she was not welcome, the sheriff's office. She walked in without knocking. Sheriff Garrett was sitting with his boots on his desk, cleaning his pistol. He looked up, a look of genuine surprise, followed by a contemptuous sneer. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he drawled. "Come to confess to aiding and abetting a fugitive. I've come to report a murder," Rosemary said, her voice shaking but resolute. She held up Franklin's journal. "The murder of my husband, Franklin Hayes, and it wasn't an Apache who did it." Garrett's eyes narrowed. He slowly took his feet off the desk. "You're hysterical, woman. Grief's addled your brain." "Was it grief that addled my brain when I found this?" she asked, placing the Double H bullet casing on his desk next to his pistol. "I took this from the man you left for dead. The man you accused of raiding. He was shot by a Double H rifle." The sheriff stared at the casing. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of panic crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of cold fury. He stood up, his bulk filling the small office. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You've been listening to the lies of a savage. Now you come in here making wild accusations." "And I have Franklin's journal," she pressed on, holding it up like a shield. His last entries. He wrote that Bart Higgins discovered a silver lode on Apache land. He wrote that Higgins tried to buy his silence and that he was afraid. Garrett lunged, not for the journal, but for her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You will give me that journal, and you will forget this fantasy. You will go home, and you will keep your mouth shut. Or so help me God. I will lock you in a cell so deep, you'll forget the sun." Suddenly the office door swung open. Bart Higgins stood there, his face a thundercloud. He had clearly been summoned by a deputy. He took in the scene Garrett manhandling Rosemary, the journal in her hand, the casing on the desk. "Bo, release her." Higgins commanded, his voice calm, but edged with menace. Garrett reluctantly let go. Rosemary stumbled back, rubbing her bruised arm. Higgins stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air crackled with tension. "Rosemary," he said, his tone one of disappointment, like a father scolding a wayward child. "I truly am sorry for your loss. It seems it has affected you more deeply than any of us knew. You're overwrought, seeing conspiracies where there are none." "I'm seeing the truth," she shot back, her courage flaring. "You murdered my husband for that silver, and you're trying to start a war to steal that land." Higgins actually smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "My dear, you have no proof. You have the ramblings of a dying savage and the diary of a man we all know was eccentric. Who is this town going to believe? Me, the man who built this community, who provides its jobs and its security? Or the hysterical widow who nurses our enemies and spits on her husband's grave by befriending his killers?" He took a step closer. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to go home. You are going to burn that ridiculous journal. You will give the sheriff that piece of brass, and you will never speak of this again. If you do, I cannot guarantee your safety. Accidents happen all the time on the frontier. Just ask your husband." The threat was naked, unambiguous. He was confessing to her, confident in his power to crush her. But as Rosemary looked into his cold, merciless eyes, she felt the last vestiges of her fear burn away. He had underestimated her. He thought she was just a hysterical woman. He didn't know she was the keeper of honor. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. She turned and fled from the office before they could react, clutching the journal to her chest. She ran down the main street, ignoring the shocked stares of the townspeople. She didn't stop until she reached the livery stable. She had to get out of town. She had to find the one person who would believe her. She had to find Kaelte. The livery owner, a wiry old man named Peterson, who owed Rosemary for a poultice that had saved his best horse, gave her a frightened look but saddled her mare without a word. He'd heard the whispers. He saw the terror in her eyes. As she galloped out of Redemption Creek, she didn't look back. She rode east toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, toward the lands of the Chiricahua. She carried little with her, Franklin's journal, the bullet casing the eagle feather Kaelte had given her, and a desperate, fragile hope. She rode hard, pushing her mare, knowing that Higgins and Garrett would not be far behind. They could not let her reach the Apache. The desert was an unforgiving furnace. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the sand created shimmering illusions in the distance. Twice she thought she saw riders behind her, and her heart pounded with terror. She pushed on her thirst, a burning torment in her throat, her body aching with every stride of the horse. She was a healer, a gardener, not a frontierswoman used to such hardship. But the image of Franklin's last journal entry, and the cold evil in Bart Higgins's eyes, fueled her beyond her limits. After a day and a half of relentless travel, she was nearing exhaustion. Her horse was lathered and stumbling. She had found Silver Creek, a meager trickle of water in the vast dryness, and was following it into the foothills. It was here, as the sun began to set, that they found her. Not Higgins's men, but two Apache riders. They appeared as if from the earth itself, silent and formidable on their painted ponies. They carried rifles, and their faces were stern, impassive masks. Rosemary's heart leaped into her throat. They flanked her, bringing her to a halt. One of them spoke in his own tongue, the words sharp and questioning. Rosemary's hand trembled as she reached into her saddlebag. She pulled out the eagle feather, its red tip vibrant against the dusty landscape, and held it up. The two warriors stared at the feather. A flicker of recognition of surprise passed between them. They exchanged a few low words. The lead rider nodded slowly. He gestured for her to follow his demeanor, shifting from hostile to cautiously neutral. They were her escorts now, not her captors. The feather had been her passport. Kael-Te had kept his word. They led her deep into a hidden canyon, where a small encampment was nestled cleverly concealed from view. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meat filled the air. Women looked up from their work, and children stopped their play to stare at the white woman being brought into their camp. An older man, his face a magnificent tapestry of wrinkles and wisdom. His bearing noble and commanding emerged from the largest wickiup. This had to be the chief. Before anyone could speak, a figure appeared from the shadows of the canyon wall. It was Kael-Te. He was still healing, but he stood tall and proud among his people. A look of profound shock and concern crossed his face when he saw her. Keeper of honor. He said, his voice a mixture of awe and alarm. What has happened? Why are you here? They know, Rosemary panted, sliding wearily from her horse. Higgins and Garrett. They know that I know the truth. She stumbled, and Kael-Te caught her, his grip strong and steady. She explained everything in a rush. Dr. Finch's fear, the discovery of the journal, the silver load, the confrontation in the sheriff's office, the open threat on her life. She handed the journal to Kael-Te. The chief, whom Kael-Te introduced as his father, Nantan, listened intently as his son translated Rosemary's story. When Kael-Te read the passages from Franklin's journal aloud in their language, a low, angry murmur spread through the assembled warriors. He then showed them the branded casing. The proof was irrefutable. The white man's greed was a poison that sought to kill them all. Just as Nantan was about to speak, a scout perched high on the canyon rim let out a sharp cry. He pointed back the way Rosemary had come. A dust cloud was rising against the twilight sky. A large one. Higgins Kael-Te said, his voice grim. He has come. Panic seized Rosemary. He's come to kill us all. He has come for a battle. He started. Nantan corrected her, his voice like the rumbling of distant thunder. He does not know we have the truth on our side. Higgins Garrett and a posse of nearly 30 deputized ranch hands and fearful townsmen rode into the mouth of the canyon, their rifles held ready. They expected to find a small, unsuspecting band of savages. They did not expect to see the Chiricahua warriors arrayed before them, not in a defensive crouch, but standing tall and resolute, with Kael-Te and his father at their head. And they certainly did not expect to see Rosemary Hayes standing beside them. Well, well, Higgins called out, trying to project confidence, though a flicker of unease showed in his eyes. It seems the traitor has found her new home. We've come for the woman Nantan. She's a criminal wanted for conspiring with wanted murderers. The only murderers here. Higgins are the ones who ride with you. Kael-Te's voice rang out clear and powerful across the canyon. He held up the bullet casing. This was fired from a double-H rifle. It is the bullet that wounded me, after you killed my kinsman. Lies, Garrett bellowed, his face red with fury. That proves nothing. Perhaps not. Rosemary called out, her voice trembling but carrying in the stillness. But does this? She held up Franklin's journal. This is my husband's journal. His last words accuse you, Bartholomew Higgins, of his murder. Not for water, but for a silver mine you wanted to steal. You are the one who murdered Franklin Hayes. A wave of shock rippled through the posse. They looked from Rosemary to Higgins, their certainty beginning to crumble. They had come to fight an Indian war, not to be accomplices to the murder of one of their own. She's delirious. She's a liar. Higgins screamed, his composure finally cracking. He raised his rifle. Kill them. Kill them all. He aimed his rifle not at a warrior, but directly at Rosemary. But before he could fire, two things happened at once. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't from Higgins' rifle. It came from within the posse. One of the younger ranch hands, his face pale with horror and guilt, had fired his pistol into the air. "She's telling the truth," he yelled. "I was there. We shot them down from the rocks. Higgins made us do it." At the same instant, a figure stepped out from behind a boulder near the posse. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, holding an old shotgun. "He's right," the doctor said, his voice shaking but firm. "Bartholomew Higgins is a murderer and a liar." I examined Franklin Hayes's body. I let this man and his puppet sheriff convince me to ignore what I saw. I will not be silent any longer. The posse dissolved into chaos. Men lowered their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion, disgust, and fear. They had been lied to, used as a private army, to cover up a murder. Higgins, his face a mask of pure rage, turned his rifle on the dissenting ranch hand. But Sheriff Garrett, seeing the tables, had turned catastrophically, made a desperate move. He spurred his horse, trying to flee back down the canyon. Kaelte, moving with astonishing speed, threw a bola he had been holding. The weighted cords wrapped around the legs of Garrett's horse, sending the animal tumbling to the ground. The sheriff was thrown clear landing in a heap in the dust the wind knocked out of him. Higgins was now alone, surrounded by the accusing eyes of the Apaches, his own men, Dr. Finch and Rosemary. His empire had crumbled in a matter of minutes. His face contorted in a snarl of defeat, and he threw his rifle to the ground. The dust began to settle in the twilight. There had been no battle, no massacre. There had been a reckoning brought about not by bullets and hatred, but by the courage of a woman who had dared to listen, the guilt of a young man who could no longer bear a lie, and the bravery of an old doctor who finally chose his conscience over his comfort. Standing between two worlds, Rosemary Hayes, the keeper of honor, looked at the wreckage of Higgins's ambition and knew that the truth once unearthed was the most powerful weapon of all. The aftermath was a quiet, stunned affair. The disarmed posse led by Dr. Finch and the contrite young ranch hand took Bartholomew Higgins and the groaning Sheriff Garrett into custody. The ride back to Redemption Creek was not a triumphant return, but a somber procession of shame. The men who had ridden out so boldly for a righteous war now understood they had been the villains of the story, and their silence was heavy with the weight of that knowledge. The next day, a federal marshal summoned by a rider sent by Dr. Finch arrived from Tucson. Faced with the confession of his own hired man, the physical evidence of the bullet casing the damning words in Franklin's journal, and the testimony of Dr. Finch and Rosemary Higgins' fate was sealed. His empire of fear collapsed like a house of cards. The trial was swift. He and Garrett were sentenced to hang, not for starting a war with the Apache, but for the cold-blooded murder of Franklin Hayes. Redemption Creek was a town transformed. The easy hatred that had bound the community together was replaced by a difficult, soul-searching guilt. Neighbors who had laughed at Rosemary now avoided her gaze not out of scorn, but out of deep-seated shame. Martha Pritchett was seen weeping outside her general store, and even the hardest of the ranch hands looked at the distant mesas with a new, uncertain respect. The town had been built on a lie, and now it had to learn to live with the truth. A week later, as a fragile peace settled over the valley, a message came for Rosemary. It was from Nantan. He requested her presence at Silver Creek. She rode out alone, unafraid this time. When she arrived, she was not met by armed guards, but by the entire Chiricahua community. They were gathered in a clearing near the sacred spring, the very place Franklin had died to protect. Nantan and Kaelte stood waiting for her. The old chief, his eyes filled with a deep, solemn wisdom, stepped forward. He spoke in his own language, his voice resonating through the canyon, while Kaelte translated for her. The white man's law has punished the ones who murdered your husband. Kaelte said, his voice soft. But that is their justice. We have our own way of marking what has passed. You, Rosemary Hayes, came to us not as a warrior with a gun, but as a healer with a good heart. You did not see an enemy. You saw a man. You sought truth when your own people offered you lies. You held our honor in your hands, and you did not let it fall. Nantan then raised a beautifully beaded deerskin pouch and presented it to her. My father says that honor is not a gift we can give you because you already carried it within you. Kaelte continued. But we can give it a name and a place among our people. You will forever be a friend to the Chiricahua. Our homes will be your home. Our food will be your food. This land which your husband's truth helped save will always welcome you. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, filled with a profound respect that transcended language and culture. The name I gave you in darkness, my father now gives you in light before all our people. Keeper of honor. The people gathered there gave a low, respectful murmur of assent. It was not a cheer, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a binding promise. Rosemary accepted the pouch, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude, more than relief. It was a sense of belonging, of having found a purpose far greater than the small life she had once known. She was no longer just the widow from Redemption Creek. Her identity was now forged in courage, compassion, and a bond with a people she had once been taught to fear. She had lost a husband, her home, and her community. But she had found herself, and she had learned that the weight of true honor, though heavy, was the most rewarding burden one could ever hope to carry. The story of Rosemary Hayes is a powerful testament to the fact that history isn't just shaped by famous generals and wealthy robber barons, but by the quiet, defiant courage of ordinary people. In a time and place where hatred was easy and violence was common, she made a choice not for a side, but for humanity. Her journey from a mocked outcast to the celebrated keeper of honor reminds us that compassion is a revolutionary act, and that one person's integrity can indeed unravel an empire of lies. The American West was forged not only with iron and steel, but with moments of profound moral courage like this one. If Rosemary's incredible story of bravery and justice resonated with you, please help us share more tales from the forgotten corners of history. These are the stories that define the true character of our past. Hit that like button Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas from the Wild West and beyond.